what does this mean for humanity and the planet? So when I first embarked on this project, I don't think I quite realized what a huge subject I was taking on. And halfway through, I was really questioning, have I got what it takes to like do this subject justice? Because it is such a huge subject when you start to zoom out and look at the broader kind of like global implications. I suppose one of the things that spurred me to write the project, so I'd known from a very young age that I didn't want to be a mother. And I always felt so odd and so strange and so like I was the only one, because I didn't really know anybody else who felt the same way as me. But then I zoomed out further and noticed that, the birth rate has been in a very steep and steady decline for about the past century. And I sort of thought, oh, wow, I'm really not the only one. Like women globally, in every country globally, are having far fewer children and increasingly having no children at all. So that was actually when the project got really interesting to me, because I just thought, wow, there's a huge shift occurring here.
What does it take to put your life's work out there in a really big way? How much can I do with this one precious life? Welcome to The Selfish Gift. If you dream of inspiring a global movement with your book, you're going to love hearing from my guest today. She wrote the book that coined the term sober curious, and now she has a new book out in which she helps women to embrace the personal decision not to have children. And that's not all that she does. She's also an editor, a publishing consultant, and she calls herself a book doula, and she's the founder of the self-publishing imprint, The Numinous. She is Ruby Warrington, author of Sober Curious, Women Without Kids, and other books besides. And I cannot wait to have this conversation. Ruby, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me. I'm really looking forward to talking to you today.
We have a lot in common. I think there's tons of synergies here. So I think this is going to be a very juicy conversation. But the first thing that I want to ask you is, how does it feel to know that you coined a term that became, hugely popular and kicked off a giant movement? I think that every self-help author dreams of having that kind of impact. Did you know that it was going to get as big as it got?
Well, when I came up with that term, I kind of needed a term to describe my own evolving relationship with alcohol and the investigation that I was doing in my own life around the relation, the way I was using alcohol and the impact that it was having on my overall well-being. And the term sober curious just really resonated for me. And it immediately resonated with everyone I spoke to about this. And I started using it publicly. I was hosting events at the time. So these were events for the sober curious, and people just got it in a way that I think is quite rare, like without really having to explain what it meant. Those two words just really encapsulated this mindset and this path of discovery, I suppose, that so many people were on. And I think the movement was already underway, but I think what Sober Curious did was give language to something that a lot of people were already grappling with or experiencing in their own lives. And with that language comes a way to talk about it. And so then everything sort of accelerated and escalated. So yeah, I first started using the term in February 2016. The book came out at the very end of 2018. And in December last year, I found a survey that had been done, and it was called something like Sober Curious Nation. And it said that 1 in 4 Americans is now familiar with the term sober curious, which is kind of amazing to think about, And I mean,
wow.
I did the thing of like trademarking the term, but I've never gone after anybody and would never go after anybody with a cease and desist, because to me, it's so much more important that the terminology gets out there. And I'm just also really grateful. I don't know if this is something to do with the times that we're living in. I am frequently credited as the person who coined that term. And I mean, there are so many terms that have sort of come into common usage, and we don't know the origin story of them. But for some reason, this has been very closely linked to me in my work. Maybe it was because I had a book out. That was the title. But yeah, I mean, it's amazing. And when what really matters, I suppose, is, I quite frequently host in-person retreats on the subject of being sober curious. And it's in those very intimate spaces that I really see the impact of this work on people's lives. and without sounding too cheesy. I mean, that's when it really is like, oh, this is a really important piece of work that I've been fortunate enough to be able to steward in this life, you know.
I love what you said about the fact that the movement was already underway, but the phrase gave people a way to understand it and talk about it. And that, I think, really demonstrates the power of language when it is, precise and has emotional resonance. And it's just so powerful. That phrase has now entered the cultural lexicon. It's really embedded in the cultural lexicon. And that's such an honor. And I've worked with many, many authors who aspire to who want to do that, and it's not that easy to come up with a catchy phrase like that everybody just gets immediately. But I know that you were a lifestyle journalist for a long time before you became a book author. And I also was a lifestyle journalist for a long time. And so I think that we have both come up through this sort of practice of identifying and writing catchy headlines, catchy taglines, catchy ways to describe things. And I think that that's really tremendously helpful. So that's just a comment on the craft side of it, aside from the cultural impact. How do you feel when you look around and you see the way that this movement has taken root? It's not only around the term sober curious, but I mean all the way into the alcohol industry and the many alcohol free alternative beverage options that are out there. And it just seems that people are embracing this in a way that they just weren't even 5 years ago. So how do you feel when you see that?
Again, I just think it's kind of like when I first started talking about being sober curious, there were so few. You could get an O'Doul's, maybe a Klaus These are alcohol-free beer brands. And I think there was one brand called Curious Elixirs who were specifically branding themselves as an alcohol alternative. And beyond that, there was really very little. So from a selfish sort of personal perspective, I'm so grateful that there are all of these incredible alcohol-free options. And yes, this is now a multi-billion-dollar industry that has sprung up. And that, I think can largely be credited to the popularity of this term sober curious. So maybe I should be out there with the trademark, trying to capitalize on this in some more ways. But I mean, we have lanes, right? My lane, I'm an author, I'm a writer. That's what I want to do. So many times over the past sort of 5-6 years, people have approached me, or not approached me in a serious way, but this should be a business. This could be a product. You should have a store. What would it be? And I consistently just come back to, well, what do I want to do with my life? And who am I? Where am I? What are my gifts? Words are my gifts. I love writing. Like, I don't really want to run a business. And so I haven't really pursued that in any way. But I think, there are two big industries that I see have really sprung up. The alcohol-free adult beverages, as they call themselves, and also sober coaching. So there's a lot of sober coaches now. There are, of course, other books. Annie Grace is a big author in this space as well. Holly Whitaker, Laura McCowan have all kind of had their own iterations of kind of alternative sobriety schools or offer coaching around sobriety that's kind of not the traditional 12-step approach. And I do sometimes wonder if there isn't room for something specifically sober curious in that space, because while these other programs are about alternative approaches to sobriety, still sobriety is the end goal. Now, I personally am completely abstinent from alcohol. That's a choice that I've come to. That's where I've arrived at in terms of what feels like a good or a healthy relationship with alcohol to me. It's just, I just don't really have any need for it in my life anymore. But by no means am I saying that has to be everybody's goal to completely remove alcohol from their life. This is really about getting very conscious about the way you use alcohol and the role that it plays for you, and making your choices about drinking from there. So I do sometimes still wonder, is there space for a sober curious offering? Because I suppose something I've had to really not come to terms with, but something I've developed, I suppose, in the past. My first book came out in 2017. In this sort of 7-year time frame, is that being an author in the nonfiction space does open doors to being a teacher on some level. And that's not something that I ever would have envisaged for myself. I'm very introverted. Public speaking has never really been something I've been drawn to. However, as I mentioned, I do lead multiple retreats, host events, talks and workshops, and I actually have, through practice, come to discover that not only do I quite enjoy it, that I'm also quite good at it. And so, yeah, I suppose as I look ahead to what this movement will become and how I could continue to be involved in it, I do wonder if there's space for a more regular, sort of consistent offering that is more about teaching and sort of guiding people through what it means to be sober curious.
Teaching and or community. Yeah. Well, I absolutely think that there is. And now my entrepreneurial brain is firing on all kinds of directions because girl, you do not need to do it any way that you don't want to do it. And I have so many thoughts. I do think that, there's a huge opportunity there for you. But I love that you are filtering all of this, sort of possibility through the lens of what do I want to do with my days? This is my life to live. And just because I created something with legs doesn't mean that it needs to pull me around the world. Like I'm still in charge of what I do and where I spend, how I spend my time and what I focus on. And I think that actually that very ethos is at the heart of your message, not only in Sober Curious, but also in Women Without Kids. It's like, don't tell me what to do. This is my life to live. And I'm going to get the most out of it in the way that feels rich and rewarding for me. One of the things that you said in Sober Curious that really resonated with me, I'm also alcohol free, and I prefer the term alcohol free, just as you prefer the term child free. One of the things that pushed you to decide to distance yourself from alcohol and eventually give it up altogether was that it was getting in the way of you knowing yourself and really fully feeling yourself and being present in your life. Why do you think that, and perhaps that's also, got resonance with the no kids thing. Why do you think that fully knowing oneself and being fully present in one's life is such a radical thing to propose that people prioritize?
Well, I mean, it's funny, I'm working on a ghostwriting project at the moment, and I found myself writing about how everybody has an agenda. Everybody has an agenda. It's human to have an agenda, an idea of how we would like things to play out. Oftentimes, we're very much encouraged to go along with other people's agendas, whether it's beginning with our parents, moving through college, moving through a kind of prescriptive life course about what life should look like in the workplace. Like we're very much subject to other people's agendas who would have us use the ultimate finite resource, our time and energy, for the furthering of their agenda. And so I think the more that we can ring fence our time and energy and really consider what is my agenda, not necessarily in a selfish way or sort of a hoarding way, but just where are my gifts, my time, my energy best spent in this life, And I think that the reason Sober Curious or the whole wider conversation about how we use alcohol is such an important part of this is because our body communicates to us primarily in feelings and sensations. And it's taken me so long. I'm in my late 40s now. It's only recently that I've really come to this clear realization. If I'm feeling a lot of anxiety around something, it's a no. Something is saying, no, that's not for you, right? Likewise, if I'm getting tingles when I'm thinking about something, that's a yes. But how many times have I overridden those feelings in order to fulfill somebody else's agenda because it was expected of me, because I didn't know what else I would do, because I was afraid, like, et cetera, et cetera. So many different reasons.
Because you're validating their choices. Yeah.
Right. Because I'm codependent on some levels. All of these things play into it. And so the reason I'm talking about, bodily, physical sensations, why do we use alcohol? Primarily, it is to change the way that we feel, right? We use alcohol to either dial down uncomfortable feelings or dial up pleasurable feelings. Whilst the anesthetic effect of alcohol is that it sort of numbs us, it sort of creates a general sense of numbness. So the more heavily we're relying on alcohol to feel, quote unquote, okay in any given situation, the less attuned we are to those natural kind of intuitive physical sensations, which manifest as thoughts and conversations, which are urging us in one direction. Go further, go towards this, pull back from this. So, I mean, another way to describe that is intuition, but I think that alcohol is one way, because we use it, like I said, to sort of manipulate our feeling state on a daily basis often. It can really muddle our connection to our intuition about where we should be, where we are maybe best serving ourselves to place our finite energy reserves. There's only so much one person can accomplish in one life. And researching women without kids, I mean, it's probably a bit cliche, but the number one deathbed regret is, I wish I had lived more true to myself. I wish I had lived my life more true to myself and not lived the life that other people wanted for me. Coming back to that thing of everybody has an agenda. Not to say that everybody's out there manipulating us and kind of, controlling our behaviors, but on some level, even with the best intentions, other people's agendas can really get in the way of us tapping into what is my agenda.
Yes. And especially, I mean, I think that, some folks are outright malevolent with their agenda pushing in, but most of us are not. Most of us are just sort of simply trying to influence the world to conform to our preferences. And if you are a person who is, sort of predisposed to, if you rank high, high on the agreeability, sort of personality spectrum, or if you are a marginalized or disenfranchised person, a person from a marginalized or disenfranchised group, there can be, it's the loudest and most forceful ego that gets to sort of like determine where everybody puts their time and attention, right? And so it can be quite a radical and self-empowering act to simply say, well, I my own needs for my life course must come first.
Yes.
And especially, I think, around the messaging about women and mothering. In our society today, I think we've come a long way from the time when all women were expected to be barefoot and pregnant and to view mothering as the only or pinnacle of accomplishment that was available to them. And yet there is still sort of, I don't know if stigma is too strong a word, but there's certainly a set of assumptions that go along with the decision to have or not have children. But you've tapped into, again, Ruby, something that I think is a little bit zeitgeisty. Like, this is something that's happening. I know in my friend group, and when I look around the sort of like the media, I see a real rise of women who are sort of opting out of that path for positive reasons of their own and not finding a whole heck of a lot of support or validation for it. In your subtitle, you referred to it as the revolutionary rise of an unsung sisterhood. Talk to me a little bit about that. What have you found in as this book has kind of, bubbled up in you and come out into the world?
Yeah, well, as you rightly say, I mean, it's really, really starting in the middle of the last century with the advent of sort of the women's liberation movement in its, second wave iteration, I suppose, was really the first time that the message that women could pursue alternative life paths to motherhood was sort of becoming more widespread, I suppose. And yes, we've had 60, 70 years of kind of undoing of the conditioning that said that that was women's only valid role in society. And the amount of pressure and stigma and internal dissonance around the decision not to pursue that path, or even to question whether that is something I want, that women experience, shows, I think, how far there still is to go for it really to become not a mainstream choice. And I'm definitely in no way, shape or form saying that anybody shouldn't have children. What I'm saying is this is a very personal orientation and one that should be normalized, not least so that people who are opting into parenthood can do so from a really conscious place of like, this is something I am consciously choosing for myself, you know? So yeah, what I landed on was, again, this is a movement that has been happening. It's an evolutionary process that has been occurring kind of subconsciously in a way. And now we need to actually start talking about it to foment it in our societies and to foment it culturally so that it does become the norm for either parenthood or non-parenthood to be an affirmative life choice, you know? Of course, it's not always as simple as choice. There's a huge cohort of women, as I've discovered in my research, who identify as childless by circumstance. There's a smaller cohort who are childless due to infertility specifically. The childless by circumstance speaks more to, I didn't meet the right person to have kids with. I haven't felt financially stable enough. I've been focused on my mental health. I couldn't find the time I was focused on building my career before I had a child, and now it's too late. So this is a huge percentage of the kind of overall child-free or childless population. But I make the point in Women Without Kids that there's a very fine line between choice and circumstance, right? The circumstances of our birth very much determine the choices that are available to us. The family and the culture that we're born into, the religious programming that we might experience as a young person, race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, all of these things determine the choices that are available to us. And then the choices we make shape our circumstances going forwards. So it's very hard to pass out choice and circumstance. I think they're very much interwoven. So yeah, I mean, the book is very, very nuanced in terms of the way I examine this subject matter, with the goal of, this is something we should be talking about a lot, you know? So much of what I've heard in the in-person events that I've hosted around the book, Women Without Kids, is I didn't know how much I needed to talk about this. I've heard women say, this is something I think about every day of my life, and I've never spoken about it out loud before because I didn't even know I could, which sounds sort of ridiculous, but that I think is how unconscious this choice has been, or how stigmatized in a way still, you know, even though this level of choice, it could be argued, is what the entire sort of feminist movement to date has been about.
Yeah, ever since
women,
the
right?
advent of the birth control pill, this, you know,
right, but
this suddenly became something that, you know, we could have some agency around.
Even going back to, you know, women getting the vote, like this has all been, so much of the movement, the feminist movement, has been about allowing women to have the same level of agency and choice in our lives as men have traditionally had. And of course, not all men. So many conversations about privilege that kind of, you know, are interwoven with this as well. But so much of this has been about, well, enabling humans to truly have agency, going back to what we were saying about, I am born into this body. I have a finite amount of time and energy and probably resource in this life. How do I use that? You know? And enabling every human who's born to actually truly have those choices, I mean, I think is probably the wider project of the feminist movement, broadening it out beyond sort of natal women to any and everybody, right? So yeah, this conversation is very much around having children specifically, not least because childbearing, child rearing is probably one of the most labor and resource intensive endeavors that a woman could possibly ever embark on in her life.
Absolutely.
Beginning with growing that person in your body and literally feeding them from your body, you know? It's just, it's huge. And yet something, because we've had this kind of idea that women are just built to do this and it's our biological imperative, women are just sort of expected to be able to do that without question and without needing to weigh my financial well-being, my relationship status, my emotional, my mental health, my other desires for my life. It should just be this thing that women sort of take in their stride. And I think there's been a bit of a backlash against the concept of like having it all. Oh, well, you can be a mum and do all these other great things. Well, no, because time and energy is finite.
Right. And getting back to what you were saying earlier about, with some things that give you a tingle and other things that weigh you down and make you feel heavy and like, well, this is not for me. And I think that all of us, no matter what circumstances we're in and what we are expected or not expected to do, all of us will benefit from tuning in to that compass, whether or not, to whatever degree we happen to have the capacity or the freedom or the opportunity to fully move into our ideal expression, at least let us know what it is.
Exactly.
So what did you learn in your research? What did you learn that surprised you or opened your eyes about this trend in society and what it means for the trend in society, meaning women reconsidering that what used to be an assumed default life choice? What does it mean for humanity and for the planet? I know that there are ecological implications to population growth and population curbing. Talk to me a little bit about those things.
Ecological and economic implications. Okay, so first of all, your question, what does this mean for humanity and the planet? So when I first embarked on this project, I don't think I quite realized what a huge subject I was taking on. And halfway through, I was really questioning, have I got what it takes to like do this subject justice? Because it is such a huge subject when you start to zoom out and look at the broader kind of like global implications. I suppose one of the things that spurred me to write the project, so I'd known from a very young age that I didn't want to be a mother. At least I didn't know I didn't want to be a mother. I knew that I had other things I aspired to and that motherhood had just never really registered for me as something I wanted to pursue. And that was something I questioned very, very deeply in my 30s, largely, as other people questioned it in me. And I always felt so odd and so strange and so like I was the only one because I didn't really know anybody else who felt the same way as me. And what was really interesting as I started to look at this as a potential subject for my next book was not only did I notice that in my own life, I was by this point in my early 40s, there were quite a few women actually who hadn't had children for a variety of different reasons. So by no means was I the only one in my own sort of friend group of colleagues. But then I zoomed out further and noticed that, the birth rate has been in a very steep and steady decline for about the past century, with a small blip in the US anyway around the kind of baby boom, hence the boomer generation of the 1940s and 50s. And I sort of thought, oh, wow, I'm really not the only one. Like women globally, in every country globally, are having far fewer children. And increasingly having no children at all. So that was actually when the project got really interesting to me, because I just thought, wow, there's a huge shift occurring here. What's happening? Because these demographic trends, the charts sort of going like this, look like these kind of charts. And then when we think, well, that downward line represents millions and millions and millions of women's individual, very difficult and incredibly personal choices about how to engage with their reproductive potential. That's just fascinating to me in a way. So yeah, what I learned is this is a global trend. This is very, very common. And then there is a lot of scaremongering around imminent population collapse, particularly on behalf of demographers and economists who are saying, well, this is a disaster for the economy. We're going to have far too many old people with not enough young people coming into the workforce, paying taxes to support our aging populations. It's kind of how the conversation goes. There are so many problems with that argument, not least how little taxpayer money is actually funneled into caring for our vulnerable populations.
Yeah, right.
So that's one point. But yeah, we also, it's not taking into account that over the same time period that the birth rate has been dropping, lifespan has increased massively. And yet people are still kind of written off as no longer useful to society past the age of 65. And yet people are now living to, more and more people are living to 100. It's predicted that people living to 100 is going to become something of the norm in this century. So there are these just really, really interesting and important conversations to be having about the global population and how the trend of people having fewer children is going to impact future generations. And most importantly, how we can work with that rather than what we see, surprise, surprise, Roe v. Wade is overturned at exactly the same time as we're having this kind of scaremongering conversation about the economic issue of population decline.
But the economic issue, the economic negative or fearful repercussions around population decline, Ruby, it kind of makes me think a little bit like a pyramid scheme, because there's also great economic risk in just rampant, unchecked, constant and ongoing population growth and explosion.
Yes.
We are seeing that. There are 8 billion people on the planet. When I was in elementary school, there were 4 billion people on the planet, I'm pretty sure. I think it was 4. When I was in the third or fourth grade was when I first learned that statistic. There were 4 billion people on the planet. By the time I was in high school, there were 6 or 7 or 5, whatever. At some point along the way, there were 6. Now there are 8. That's nuts. I'm only 52 years old and I have seen the population of the earth double. So when we talk about the economic fear of population decline or the economic negative repercussions, what we're talking about is the pyramid scheme collapsing.
Yes.
And yet it cannot go on forever.
It can't just continue
by definition,
forever.
It can't go on forever. And so, I guess we have to find a new way to, what is an economic system for? It's to ensure the flow of resources from, through people's lives. That is all it is for. And, and there are other ways to ensure that other than this kind of constant hockey stick growth that has no upper ceiling. So I love that you're tying that strand into this discussion that is so personal, but it's also global.
Totally. And this is a pyramid scheme in more ways than one, because the vast majority of the wealth that is generated by the working force is concentrated in the top 0.0001% or something of the population. So yes, it's time. The pyramid is going to collapse. And women without kids are part of that. And hence, here's even more stigma about women who are talking about this choice or valorizing this choice or even questioning whether they want to become mothers. Because here's the other thing. If every woman in the workforce left the workforce to become a stay-at-home mother and to really give her children and the majority of her time and attention to raising her children, we would have an immediate economic crisis. We would have economic collapse overnight if that happened. Because the current economic system relies on women doing both child-rearing labor and labor in the workforce.
Well, Ruby, as I was looking at your body of work, so let's zoom out a little bit and contextualize this work that you do. I was looking at, your body of work includes, Sober Curious, Women Without Kids, and also a book on modern spirituality, which the name escapes me at the moment.
Material Girl, Mystical World.
Right, which I just love. And so, and I was looking for, with my publisher's hat on, I'm looking and thinking like, if I was an agent or a publisher, how do I make sense of this person? What is Ruby's author brand? And I wondered whether there was a moment where you were concerned about getting pigeonholed as an alcohol or sobriety author. I wonder if you were, thinking about like memoir versus a journalistic approach to writing and trying to find your kind of core identity. And what it seems to me is that there's a common thread at this point running through your books, which is about bucking societal messages that say that you're expected to want something, whether it's alcohol or kids. And there's a kind of a rebel spirit that flows through your books. Do you think that this is foundational to you as a writer and a thinker?
Thanks for that, because I'm currently engaged in this process of what is my personal brand?
What's my shtick?
Yeah. I mean, so the 3 books that you've mentioned have all been very much born out of something I've been deeply investigating in my own life, and something I've really needed to kind of research for myself. And Material Girl, Mystical World, I mean, the reason I was drawn to sort of modern spirituality and all of the practices that are associated with that, astrology, tarot, yoga, meditation, all of that stuff, it was the same time I was removing alcohol from my life. And I wanted to know myself better. I wanted to really tap much more deeply into, who am I underneath all the conditioning? Like, what does it really mean to be me? And those practices are all very much about really finding a sort of a true self, I suppose, for me anyway. Yeah. And so there has definitely been that through line, that idea of who am I without the conditioning? If all of the societal messages about what I should be doing, who I should be, how I should be behaving, where I should be putting my time and energy were stripped away, then how would I be living this life, you know? So there's a through line there. And of course, so much of living that life then does involve willfully removing yourself from the in-group, which can be an incredibly lonely, daunting, and precarious operation. To willfully put yourself in the out-group is terrifying sometimes. And so I think that there is a through line in my work, which is about saying to people who maybe feel like outsiders, or people who are just questioning, is this my path? There's more of us. We're over here. The water's fine. Come in, come join us, you know, and empowering people to kind of live that, maybe have a slightly more rebellious spirit. But I suppose so my background is magazine journalism. And I've equally always been very, very interested in just what makes people tick. And that sort of shows up in social trends. And so a lot of the journalism that I did was around social trends, kind of reporting on everybody's doing this or everybody's interested in this. And at the time, at that stage in my career, when I embarked on that path, I was just trying to think of a way I could make a living out of writing. And magazine journalism still was fairly, lucrative back in 1998. Not lucrative, but, you could get a job. At least it paid. It doesn't pay anymore,
That's right.
So, I was really most concerned with how can I earn a living with this mind of mine,
Well, I love that, because
my mind was just very interested.
And it trained you, or, perhaps you were already predisposed, but you developed a sense of what is in the collective consciousness. What are people thinking and talking about? Where's the buzz? And that's a beneficial sense for any author to develop, I think, an understanding of where they fit into the cultural zeitgeist at any given time. But I'm curious about what your agent said when you first brought up the idea of Women Without Kids, after having written Sober Curious and seen it become an international bestseller. Did they try to dissuade you from straying into such a different topic? Or were they like, yeah, Ruby, that's so you, go?
It was already quite a different topic from Material Girl. Sober Curious was quite a different topic from Material Girl, Mystical World. Although what's interesting, in that first book, there is a chapter about not having children, and there is a chapter about sobriety. So the seeds were already planted for these other two books in that first book. My agent was very supportive. She was most interested in me writing a book I really wanted to write.
Great.
However, nobody wanted to buy it.
We
had absolute tumbleweed when we pitched the proposal. And then the responses that came back were very much, this isn't Ruby's audience. Ruby's not the right person to write this book. Ruby's audience is sober curious. And that was very demoralizing. It was kind of depressing, because I just thought, gosh, this is in a way one of the effects of this era of kind of the personal brand,
Yeah.
I sort of feel like, because, and I've not fallen victim to, but I've experienced this a couple of times now. You have to build a platform, build an audience before you can get a book deal. But then if you want to write a book on a different subject, you have to kind of start again from scratch. And I've been through that sort of 3 times now with my 3 different books. And it's exhausting. It's really exhausting. But this brain, I've always written about so many different subjects and been interested in so many different things, and that's who I am. So I think, yes, I have been doing some more thinking lately around what is the through line, and if I think about the work I want to put into platform building or audience growth going forward, how can I communicate what I'm doing in a way that kind of connects the dots between my different projects. So that's sort of a process I'm engaged in at the moment.
I love it. I want to talk to you about it so much more, because I think that, you know, I would love to be a mirror for you that on that investigation. It can be really hard to see ourselves as others see us, and what I see here is just a really deep kind of braid of there's all about all of these things braid together very naturally around authenticity and sort of determined self-validation, you know, sort of whether that means, as you say, putting yourself in the out group, bumping up against the headwinds of cultural messaging and societal pressure, and having the courage and knowing the rewards of standing firm in your integrity and your authenticity as a human, valuing the preciousness of the life that you are living. So I think that's what Ruby Warrington is, personally, for what it's worth.
I mean, that's what it feels like. And it's interesting. For me, it's actually less about the rewards of pursuing a life that feels true to me and more about avoiding the pitfalls of living a life that is not mine. You know, that's just, more, whether it comes more from that side. But no, and I mean, I have thought about, do I sort of concept a more general kind of self-help book that's on this subject? But it's hard. I'm just not excited. I'm not excited by the general in the same way that when I get my teeth into a really meaty subject that I can research and bring that journalistic piece to, that's what gets my juices going. And so I'm sort of turned off by the idea of doing you're a badass for kind of like, you know,
and I don't think that
the rebels
necessarily,
or whatever it is, but
I don't suggest that needs to be like the explicit focus of the next book that you write. But I love the fact that even in the process of determining what to write next, that this is the active force that's animating you, is like, do I get excited about this topic, about this project? Do I feel like I have, you know, lots of ideas bursting forth and a thirst to research further? And on that note, I'd love to pivot into a discussion about your writing process itself. And what's exciting about talking about this with you is you're not only a successful author of books, but you have a deep background in your craft as a journalist, which many self-help and memoir authors do not have. And as if those two strengths weren't enough, you also are a coach and collaborative editor for other writers. So you understand what it is like to coach someone who is just developing their skills in this area. So lots to talk about here. Okay, the first thing the way that I want to go into this is to talk about this intersection between personal narrative nonfiction. You can call it memoir, but this isn't exactly, your books are not exactly a memoir, but they have strong memoiristic elements. And where that overlaps with prescriptive nonfiction, but also where that overlaps with what I would think your books are more accurately termed would be like think pieces with a first person lens. So because they're journalistic in nature. And I think that many people who feel a kind of like a stirring to write a nonfiction book, they get stuck on this question of, should it be a memoir or should it be a self-help book, like a how-to book? And it's really hard for the newcomer to make that determination. And then let alone this third way, which you exemplify, which is this kind of more journalistic approach where it's not like you did Sober Curious with, actually, I don't know how much the prescriptive elements were. And I'd be curious to hear whether you think that they are prescriptive, these two most recent books, or whether you think they are think pieces. I think that they're more sort of analytical, journalistic think pieces on the subject. But okay, that was a long setup. Let me ask the question. The question is, what do you think people that are new to writing a book and want to write some kind of narrative nonfiction book, some kind of nonfiction book, what do they get wrong about understanding what type of book it is or should be?
What do people get wrong?
Also, feel free to correct me or comment
Yeah,
on
well, I'm
my
wondering, I mean,
observations about you, prescriptive versus,
I think that the three sort of styles that you've described, memoir, more prescriptive self-help, and more sort of like journalistic nonfiction, they're three different skill sets, actually. Memoir is very akin to novel writing. You're telling a story over an extended period of time. That's a very specific form of writing, which I don't have particular skill for. I'm hoping to develop that skill in myself, but this is about storytelling. And so the storytelling elements have to be really strong. The set and the setting, the plot, the way that things unfold over a period of time.
Character development.
Prescriptive nonfiction, character development, exactly. Prescriptive nonfiction is very coachy. It's that coaching voice of like, I'm going to talk to you about this and I'm going to teach you this. And again, that leaves me a bit cold. And I think one of the reasons I don't like prescriptive, and I never really read prescriptive nonfiction, is because not only do I not like being told what to do, I don't really like telling people what to do because I don't think it is my voice. I'm very much of the mindset of like, not you do you in a kind of like, you go off and just do your thing. But I'm like, who am I to tell you how to live your life? Who am I to tell you what's going to work for you? The most important thing I think I can do is educate you, give you the facts, open your eyes so that you can then kind of map your own path, which is why this journalistic approach suits me. That's the skill set that I have developed over 25 years kind of working in this way, but also it's just kind of how my mind works as well. And so I think the first thing that people should consider is, what's my storytelling style? What kind of writing am I most, do I have the strongest skills in? Which is not to say, yes, as you know, I blend memoirish elements into my journalistic books. And one of the reasons I do that is because story is just so much more interesting and engaging. And I really want to, because I think that otherwise very journalistic books can be a bit academic and dry. And I want to engage people from a kind of feeling place with the work, with the education that I want to give them. And this is kind of how I quote unquote teach on my retreats and stuff as well. It's incredibly personable. I'm not standing in front of a room sort of, do this, then do this, and here you need to know this. I'm engaging people in storytelling, both sharing their own stories, sharing my stories, and then we're having a conversation about what comes up out of that. And so that's just kind of my communication style, and that's my writing style. So I think that approaching your subject matter, really thinking about, how do I like to deliver information? Even thinking about, am I the person, at dinner regaling people with like a half an hour story about my latest trip? Or am I telling people about articles that I've read that I've found really fascinating? I mean, just how do I pass on information, and sort of approaching from that place. And I think also not assuming that has to be one or the other, and that it can't be a sort of an amalgamation of different styles, I suppose. So long as there is a good structure in place, and a lot of the work I do just in kind of general coaching work is helping people sort of get a really good structure for the book in place, sort of that can serve as a foundation in a way for the writing that they then do. Because having a structure, I think, is really important, regardless of what style of book it is.
Please say more about that. Are there any sort of like, is every book structure totally different, the projects that you work on, or have you identified any sort of like foundational rules or formats and structures that people should know about and explore?
Well, yes, it definitely depends on the subject matter. But I think it's really important to start off with, what do my readers need to know in order for what I am going to say to make sense? If that makes sense, Sometimes, yes, particularly with something more memoirish or more dramatic, you might want to go in open with a really dramatic scene, but then you're going to need to do some backstory to kind of like let people know why this matters and how we got here, So I think just kind of really as a foundational structure piece, like what do my audience and my readers really need to know in order for this to make sense, and sort of going from that place, which sounds so basic.
But many overlook it. Yeah.
Many
Yeah.
overlook that because oftentimes, particularly when it's people who aren't necessarily professional writers, they're coming because they have a business or a practice that they've developed that they want to turn into a book. Their work is so familiar to them. They're so intimate with it that those extra kind of explanatory pieces are so obvious they don't see them, but they're absolutely necessary in terms of translating the work into a book that people can engage with on its own, in its own right, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. So when you sat down to work on a new book, and I know that that begins long before sort of like the first word is written. How do you begin to explore the idea for a book that you think you might want to write? What does your process look like?
Well, I read a lot, although it's funny, I've been finding myself reading a bit less the past year, but I think I am just a bit burnt out and I need to empty the tank before I can kind of like take in more. But typically I'll find myself starting to collect articles or collect research or collect Instagram posts or blogs on a certain subject or theme. And then a theme or an area of interest will reveal itself, I suppose. And like I said, with all of my books, there's been a very personal impetus for doing that research. But then I will typically just kind of, because my books are very research heavy, kind of dive deeper into the research and start to just kind of create just a general notes app. It's typically a notes app on my phone. Any thoughts, any statistics, any quotes, just anything will go onto that notes app. And then at some point when it gets too big to be practical to have that on my phone, I'll transfer that to Word documents and sort of start lumping quotes, articles into kind of general areas of correlation, which may become chapters. And so when it comes to actually sitting down to write the book, it would be a question of going through all of that research and all of those ideas. Because a lot of times they'll just be like thoughts that I've had in relation to the subject, and really start of doing a fine-tooth comb and passing out what feels good, what doesn't, what feels relevant, and trying to help them find what chapters they belong to in a book. So it sort of begins with the research for me, I suppose.
And are you a big outliner? I'm wondering whether, because you're an experienced journalist, whether you write in a really organized and clean, direct way, or do you also have a shitty first draft where you're just sort of wandering through the meadow of your thoughts?
I do not do shitty first drafts, which is a little bit controversial because I know that's a lot of people's number one piece of advice.
You're not alone. I've talked to other authors who work that way too. Yeah, kind of straight to polish. Planning and polishing.
I think perhaps it's because from the very beginning of my career, I have earned money from writing. I've never been a journaler. I've never had that sense of like, I just need an outlet for my words, because I've always had an outlet for my words and I've always got paid for my words. And so I don't have this sort of, it just feels like a waste of time and energy to be generating a ton of words that are not going to get used. So yeah, I mean, I have these, I call them sort of like I have a content bucket of all my research for each chapter. And then out of that, I will create a loose structure, which typically does go a bit all over the place. And I'm not saying that I can produce a perfect draft the first time. No, I'll rewrite my first draft many times and it may get restructured, but I want as much of that first draft as possible to be usable material. I'm not like, Lauren Groff. I read an interview with Lauren Groff recently, as a novelist. She apparently, her process with her novels is to write the entire novel in longhand.
No.
Take that draft, put it in a drawer, never look at it again, and then start again.
I can understand that when you're coming at it from a novel, if you're writing a novel and it may be similar for those writing memoirs, sometimes you just need to clear all of the kind of, there's a crowd of voices in your head and you just need to sort of purge and kind of clear the room and let them have their say before you even know what you want to say and what you want to do. But it makes so much sense, Ruby, that because you are coming from a journalistic background, and especially I think magazine journalism, which, you're always, you're newspaper journalism too, but it's deadline driven. Generally, people who come up from that writing path, write lucidly and quickly. Like that's,
Mm-hmm.
that's,
Yeah.
and
I
if
learned
anything,
to, and that's something
if
I've
anything,
had to learn.
folks with that background can sometimes struggle a little bit to lean into the more organic, personal elements of writing, where you're discovering along the way, or you're putting like a very personal spin on something. I've talked to a lot of journalists who really, are uncomfortable putting themselves in the frame initially, and they have to grapple with that a little bit. And actually, that's something I wanted to ask you about too. Did you ever sort of struggle with this? Journalists are usually they're in the background, they're behind the scenes of their own writing. And you are not only in your books, but you're writing about very personal and sometimes controversial topics. How have you navigated the public life, private life boundary as an introvert, which I know that you are an introvert?
Well, there's something else I want to just mention. So you mentioned that it can be quite hard for people who have a journalistic background to kind of write the more narrative, in the more sort of narrative storytelling way. And that's definitely something I have found in myself, because I'm always asking myself, because this is how you're trained as a journalist, does this sentence matter? What's the point? Does it have space? Are you overwriting? Whereas with fiction and even memoir, there's a lot more space to just kind of set the scene.
Yeah, right.
Not every word has to have meaning or purpose. You're not necessarily writing to a word limit. And as I do experiment with more of that kind of writing myself, I'm finding there's a lot of unlearning to do, but it's kind of exciting as well. It's funny in terms of the personal stuff, like I'm not a big oversharer on like social media necessarily. I'm quite sort of behind the scenes in that space, but there's something about putting really deep, dark personal secrets into my books that doesn't feel exposing to me at all. And I think there's something about it feels at a remove. It doesn't feel like I am exposing myself. It sort of feels like the story is there between the pages, kind of hidden away from view, even if, thousands of people might read it. And what's been interesting as well is because audiobooks are a thing, and I've read all my own audiobooks. When I meet people who've read the audiobook, they really do act as if they know me very, very well, because I've literally been telling them like my life stories kind of in their ear in this very intimate way. So that can be a little bit disorienting. But yeah, I suppose I don't feel precious about my privacy. I sort of feel like this is who I am, and here it is, And I think that's, again, ties back into that quote unquote personal brand of just being comfortable, being authentic, With Women Without Kids, because I was writing about other family members, that was a lot more daunting and had a lot more, I grappled a lot more with what to include, what not to include, what was my story to tell, what wasn't, how my truth might differ from their truths. And with that book, I gave the manuscript unedited, meaning, the first draft, to both my parents to read, with the express kind of, instruction: anything that you don't like won't go in here. Just let me know.
That's very generous of you, and not everyone shares that advice in terms of how to deal with friends and family members that appear in your work. I've heard the advice is sort of like send them something that's on its way to the printer, so that they can kind of like have a last ditch power of veto and not actually shape the narrative. But that's really generous of you to do that, and you're pleased with that approach and the level of involvement.
Yeah,
that you gave
personally, I
your
can't imagine. I just think that the damage that could be done to relationships by not engaging in family. It depends. Obviously, every individual is unique, and maybe the damage has already been done, and it doesn't matter. And that's part of what's being written about. But I don't think I could have confidently promoted the book if I had any shadow of a doubt about my parents being mortified or upset or unhappy with what I had said about them and what elements of their short stories I had shared. You know, I wouldn't have felt confident that I could go out there and really shout about this book, knowing that. So I guess there was a selfish element too. Like I wanted to know that this was all good. Just had the full go ahead from everybody so that I could really feel confident about putting it out in the world. Because it is and I think with this subject matter as well, it's incredibly sensitive, you know?
Yeah.
This subject
well,
matter
none of that doesn't surprise me that you approach it that way, because, you know, I know you to be a person who is really devoted to the values of care and authenticity, being a mindful human being. So that makes so much sense. Ruby, I feel like there's a zillion things that we could talk about. We're coming up on an hour, but we haven't even touched on publishing options and, you know, your self-publishing imprint versus the fact that you're a traditionally published author. I don't think we even have time to get into that, but I do want to ask you, how can people work with you? You do work with individuals. You mentioned that you're working on a ghostwriting project right now. And I know that you have, various sort of programs and services that you offer as a book coach. That would just be a dream, I think, for so many individuals who are kind of like embarking on this path. So what kind of person do you like to work with, and how can they get in touch with you?
I mean, a lot of it is down to chemistry. I like working with people I can have really good conversations with. And so, you know, with people, particularly people who I'm potentially embarking on a longer project with, like a ghostwriting project or even an in-depth writing collaboration on a full manuscript, then I have to like the idea. I have to be excited by what they want to write about, the work that they're doing. But yeah, I work with people from the very entry level. I think I have an idea. I don't quite know what it is. What could this book be? Just some general coaching around that. I help people develop full proposals for them to query agents with. And then, yes, I work with people on full manuscript projects, helping them, holding their hand really through the whole writing process, which typically involves some kind of co-writing, and if not full sort of ghost write. So yeah, I work with people across the board, really. Lots of my proposal clients have landed really great deals with traditional publishers. I have worked with multiple people to self-publish their books as well through Numinous Books, which is it's kind of pretty low touch on my end. I'm not doing a huge amount in terms of helping them market and sell their books. Because again, my skill set is the writing piece, it's the research piece, it's the getting the thing made. That's what I love to do. So yeah, I mean, people can find me at rubywarrington.com. There's contact form on my website. I'm on Instagram at Ruby Warrington. So all of that said, and it's interesting, we should probably have this conversation in a year's time. I'm going to be taking a bit of a step back from client work in 2024, just because I really am feeling it's been a lot since I started doing this work, Maggie. In 2020, I've worked on 15 full manuscripts with people.
Wow.
As well as just countless proposals, and done countless coaching projects, including concepting, writing, and launching Women Without Kids kind of in the background of all of that. And I just am feeling quite, I just need to empty my head of words, So I'm going to be very selective about the client work that I take on this year.
Great. Oh, well, I can't wait to see where you go next in your writing and in your life. And I just want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for your thoughtful, intelligent, insightful, generous conversation today. It was, such a joy to spend time inside your world and get a peek inside your mind. Thank you so much, Ruby.
I love this conversation. Thanks for having me.
I really hope this conversation has inspired you to give so much of your gift to the world that it expands you into your greatest possible version of yourself. Remember, it's not selfish just because we also benefit from it. And here's where I get to make a selfish request. New podcasts need all the help they can get. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate the show and subscribe to us on your favorite platform. Don't forget to follow us on Instagram at Selfish Gift Podcast. And send me a DM. I'd love to hear how you're sharing your gift with the world.